Somewhere, in the hush before history was written down, someone was sick, and someone else knelt beside them. Picture the inside of a cave, warmed only by embers. Smoke curling toward a low stone ceiling. Furs pulled close around aching shoulders. Outside, the world is vast, and cold, and indifferent. Inside, there is only the sound of breathing, slow, uneven, watched over. There were no clinics then. No vials, no white coats, no glowing screens with answers. And yet, somehow, our ancestors survived. Not just the strong ones. Not just the lucky ones. Enough of them survived, generation after generation, to become us. Think, for a moment, of everything that had to go right. A wound that could have festered, instead closing clean. A fever that could have climbed forever, instead breaking quietly in the night. A cough that could have spread through an entire camp, instead staying contained to one small shelter, apart from the rest. None of this happened by chance alone. Somewhere in all of it, there was knowledge. Fragile, unwritten, easily lost, but real. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Long before agriculture, long before writing, long before anything we would recognize as a hospital, early humans were already treating wounds, setting bones, and reaching for specific plants to ease specific pains. Not by accident, by memory, by observation, by trial and loss and trying again. We tend to imagine the deep past as a place where illness simply happened to people, where they were passive, waiting for nature's verdict. But the deeper we look, the more that picture dissolves. What we find instead is something closer to a quiet, ongoing negotiation between our ancestors and the sicknesses that threatened them. A negotiation carried out with nothing more than bark, ash, careful hands, and time. It is easy, from where we sit now, surrounded by everything modern medicine can offer, to imagine that knowledge as primitive, small, a stepping stone toward something better, and nothing more. But that framing misses something important. The knowledge our ancestors carried was not a lesser version of medicine, waiting to be replaced. It was, in its own time and place, the entire difference between a community that endured and one that didn't. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, not as a shadow of what came later, but as an achievement in its own right, built without a single one of the tools we now consider essential. We tend to imagine prehistoric people as helpless against illness, fragile, at the mercy of nature. But the evidence, quiet, buried, waiting patiently in the earth for tens of thousands of years, tells a gentler and more complicated story. In a cave in northern Spain, researchers once examined the fossilized teeth of a Neanderthal, a young individual who had lived and suffered around 48,000 years ago. Trapped in the hardened plaque along the teeth, preserved by nothing but time and stillness, were microscopic traces of plants. Poplar bark, a plant containing a natural compound chemically related to something we still use today, the same family of molecule found in aspirin. This Neanderthal had a dental abscess, a painful one, and in the plaque of the same tooth, researchers also found the signature of a mold, the same mold that, thousands of years later, would give rise to the discovery of penicillin. Let that settle for a moment. Long before anyone understood what a molecule was, before anyone had a word for infection or antibiotic, someone in that cold, wooded landscape was already chewing on bark to dull the ache. Already, in some instinctive, inherited way, reaching for something that helped. We don't know if they understood why it worked. Almost certainly, they didn't. But understanding the mechanism was never the point. The point was relief. The point was surviving one more difficult night. And they were not alone in this. Other Neanderthal remains, found at different sites across Europe, show similar patterns. Traces of yarrow and chamomile, plants with no real nutritional value. Bitter. Not something you'd eat for pleasure. The kind of plant you'd only keep returning to if you had learned, somehow, that it made you feel less unwell. This is one of the oldest kinds of knowledge our species, and our nearest relatives, ever carried. Not knowledge of atoms or cells. A quieter kind, passed down not through books, but through watching. Through someone older saying, without needing many words, asterisk this one. Chew this one, when it hurts. Asterisk. It is worth imagining what that transmission of knowledge might have actually looked like. A child, watching a parent press a particular leaf against a wound. Noticing which plants were gathered only when someone was unwell, never for food. Learning, slowly, through repetition rather than explanation, which parts of the landscape were medicine and which were simply green. There was no textbook. There didn't need to be. The forest itself was the textbook, and attention was the only tuition required. There is something else worth noting about that single Neanderthal, and the traces left in the plaque of his teeth. He also seems to have avoided a plant that, chemically, might have been expected to help with his particular condition. A bitter, aromatic herb his relatives elsewhere are known to have used, but one he appears to have skipped entirely. Researchers have speculated, cautiously, that its taste may simply have been unbearable to him, even in the face of pain. It's a small, strangely human detail. Illness, discomfort, medicine, and still, somewhere in there, a matter of individual preference. A reminder that the people who lived these ancient lives were not simply case studies. They were individuals, with their own tolerances, their own tastes, their own small refusals. Long before anyone had heard the word contagious, something in early human communities already seemed to understand a version of it. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, both in the deep past and in a small number of communities still living close to ancestral traditions today, have noted a recurring, almost universal pattern. When someone becomes seriously ill, especially with something unfamiliar, something that spreads quickly through coughing or touch, the group instinctively creates distance. Not always out of coldness. Often out of care, layered with fear. A separate shelter. A different fire. Someone assigned, quietly, without ceremony, to bring water and food, and no one else. We don't have a written record from 50,000 years ago explaining this behavior. We can't interview someone from a Paleolithic band and ask, why did you build a second shelter for your sister when her fever came? But the pattern shows up again, and again, and again, across cultures with no contact with one another. Which tells us something quietly profound. This instinct, to isolate the sick, to protect the well, may be older than agriculture. Older than permanent settlements. It may be something closer to a survival reflex, refined slowly over hundreds of generations, long before anyone had a germ theory to explain why it worked. It only had to work. It didn't have to be understood. And in a strange way, this makes the earliest form of quarantine not a medical invention at all, but something closer to an emotional one. A community learning, through repeated loss, what distance could save, and what closeness could cost. Later, as human groups grew larger and settled into villages, this instinct hardened into something closer to custom. Ancient texts from early agricultural societies, writings that survive from Mesopotamia and the Levant, thousands of years old, describe practices that sound startlingly familiar. Individuals with certain skin conditions kept apart from the community for a set period. Homes marked, in some way, to warn visitors before they entered. None of this was medicine as we would define it today. But it was, in its own quiet way, public health, built not from laboratories, but from grief and the slow, hard-won memory of what grief had taught. Even the architecture of some ancient settlements seems to whisper this same instinct. Archaeologists studying certain Neolithic villages have noted structures positioned slightly apart from the main cluster of homes. Small, separate, easy to reach but easy to avoid. We can't always know their exact purpose. But the pattern rhymes, quietly, with everything else we've learned about how our ancestors responded to illness. Distance, offered not as punishment, but as protection. It is worth pausing on how difficult this must have been, emotionally, in small groups where every member mattered enormously to daily survival. To separate a mother from her children. To leave someone alone through the worst hours of a fever, knowing that company might comfort them but also might carry the illness further. These were not easy choices, made lightly. They were choices made and remade, generation after generation, weighed each time against the very real cost of losing someone to loneliness rather than illness. That the instinct persisted anyway, that it shows up so consistently across cultures with no contact between them, suggests it was, again and again, the choice that ultimately saved more lives than it cost. Consider, for a moment, the skeleton of a man who lived roughly 36,000 years ago, in what is now the region of Dolní Věstonice, in the modern-day Czech Republic. His bones tell a story of hardship. A deformed hip. A leg that likely left him with a significant limp, possibly from birth. By almost any measure, In a world built around hunting, running, gathering, he should not have survived long. And yet, the evidence suggests he lived well into what would then have been considered old age. Someone carried food to him when the group moved. Someone made space for him at the fire. Someone, across years, not days, years, decided that his life was worth the extra effort it took to keep him in it. This is not a story about medicine, exactly. There was no cure for his condition, no treatment that fixed his hip. But it is a story about survival, and it reveals something we sometimes forget when we picture the ancient past as brutal and purely competitive. We often carry a mental image of prehistoric life shaped by phrases like survival of the fittest, a world where the weak were simply left behind, where only strength and speed determined who lived to see another season. But the archaeological record tells a more complicated, more tender story. Across many ancient sites, researchers have found evidence of individuals who lived for years, sometimes decades, with conditions that would have made independent survival essentially impossible. Severe arthritis, missing limbs, blindness, illnesses that would have left them unable to hunt, to gather, to keep pace with a moving group. And yet, there they are, in the burial record, having lived long past the point where their condition first appeared. Every one of those long lives represents a choice, made and remade by an entire community, to carry someone who could no longer fully carry themselves. Care itself was a kind of medicine, not a plant, not a procedure. Simply, someone deciding, again and again, to help. Elsewhere, archaeologists have found ancient healed fractures, bones that broke and then knit back together, slightly crooked, but strong. A broken femur, properly set, requires someone to hold the leg still, to splint it, to feed the person who cannot hunt for weeks or months while it heals. That kind of survival does not happen by accident. It requires a hand that knew, somehow, how to press a broken limb into something close to straight, and the patience of everyone around them to let that healing take its slow, uneventful course. There is another case, further north, of a skeleton dating back roughly 7,000 years, showing the earliest known evidence of a deliberate amputation, a lower leg, removed with careful precision, the bone healed and remodeled afterward, meaning the person lived for years following the surgery. Whoever performed that operation understood something about bleeding, something about infection, something about pain, even without a single word for any of it in the way we use those words today. They understood it through consequence. Through watching what happened when a wound was left untreated, and comparing it, quietly, to what happened when it wasn't. And this points to something remarkable. Surgery, in some rudimentary form, is not a modern invention. Evidence of trepanation, a procedure involving the careful removal of a small section of skull, likely to relieve pressure, treat head trauma, or address seizures, appears at sites scattered across the ancient world, from Europe to South America, thousands of years apart, with no connection between them. And many of those skulls show healed bone around the opening, which means the patient survived. Not once, in isolated cases, but across cultures, across centuries, again and again. In parts of ancient Peru, researchers studying hundreds of trepanned skulls found something even more striking. The survival rate appeared to improve over centuries, as practitioners refined their technique. Earlier skulls show more signs of infection, more incomplete healing. Later skulls, from cultures separated from the earlier ones only by time, show cleaner openings, better healing, fewer complications. This is, in its own quiet way, the scientific method at work, long before anyone called it that. Observation, adjustment, improvement, passed down from one generation of healers to the next, refined not through controlled experiments, but through the accumulated weight of lived outcomes, watched closely and remembered. As human groups moved across different landscapes, forests, coastlines, mountains, deserts, they inherited something almost as valuable as fire, a working knowledge of the plants around them. Willow bark, chewed or brewed, to ease pain and fever, the same natural compound, essentially, that would one day be refined into aspirin. Garlic, used across dozens of unrelated ancient cultures, for its natural antimicrobial properties, long before anyone understood what a microbe was. Honey, sticky, slow to spoil, mildly antibacterial, packed directly onto wounds to help seal them from the air and slow infection. None of this was random. Trial and error, sustained across thousands of years, is not the same as guessing. It is a kind of collective memory, refined generation after generation, tested not in laboratories, but in lived, repeated experience. A plant that helped would be remembered. A plant that harmed would be avoided, and the story of why would be passed down as warning. Some of what they learned still sits, quietly, inside our modern medicine cabinets, traced back, ingredient by ingredient, to knowledge first gathered by people with no written language at all. Consider Otzi, the mummified traveler discovered frozen in the Alps, who lived roughly 5,300 years ago. When researchers examined his remains closely, they found something unexpected tucked into a small leather pouch he carried, a fungus known to have both antibacterial and styptic properties, useful for stopping bleeding and treating minor wounds. He also carried another fungus, one long associated in later folk medicine with treating intestinal parasites, and when his remains were examined further, traces of exactly the kind of parasite that fungus was believed to treat were found in his gut. He was not guessing. He was carrying a small, personal medicine kit, assembled with intention, chosen from everything the landscape offered, kept close because he knew, somehow, that he might need it. Otzi also bore a series of tattoos across his body. Simple lines and crosses, inked into his skin at points that, remarkably, correspond closely to areas of joint pain, arthritis, and old injury revealed by later medical scans of his remains. Some researchers believe these markings may represent an early form of pain treatment, not unlike the pressure points used in acupuncture, a tradition that would not be formally documented in writing for thousands of years afterward, on the other side of the world, in ancient China. Two traditions. No contact between them. And yet, both may have arrived, independently, at a similar idea, that specific points on the body, treated in specific ways, could ease specific kinds of pain. And some of it we've lost. Entire traditions, entire local knowledge systems, faded when a community disappeared, or when a language stopped being spoken. Every lost plant name is, in its own small way, a lost chapter of medical history. As human societies grew larger, settling along the great rivers of the ancient world, something changed. Knowledge that once lived only in memory began, slowly, to be written down. In ancient Egypt, along the banks of the Nile, physicians began recording their observations on papyrus, some of the oldest surviving medical documents in human history. One of them, now known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, reads almost like a modern trauma manual. Case after case, describing a specific injury, the examination performed, and the likely outcome, sometimes hopeful, sometimes honest about cases beyond help. It is startlingly clinical. Startlingly careful. A document written by people who had clearly treated many wounds, and were trying, methodically, to pass that experience forward. Egyptian healers understood the importance of cleanliness in ways that would not be scientifically explained for thousands of years afterward. Wounds washed. Dressings changed. Honey, again, used generously, this time recorded in writing, rather than inferred from residue on ancient teeth. Further east, in ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets preserve some of the earliest known prescriptions. Combinations of plants, minerals, and animal products, measured out with careful proportions, prepared in specific ways for specific ailments. Alongside these practical remedies, prayers were often recorded too, a reminder again that in the ancient mind, the line between physical treatment and spiritual comfort was rarely drawn as sharply as we draw it now. And in ancient India, a tradition began to take shape that would eventually be called Ayurveda, a system built around balance, built around the idea that health was not simply the absence of illness, but a state of harmony between body, environment, and mind. Herbs were catalogued by the hundreds. Diet was treated as medicine in its own right, long before the phrase became a modern wellness slogan. Surgical techniques, including some of the earliest recorded methods for reconstructive surgery, were documented in detail. In ancient China, meanwhile, physicians were developing an entirely separate framework, one built around balance and flow, around the idea that illness arose when something in the body's natural rhythm fell out of alignment. Acupuncture, herbal formulas combining dozens of ingredients, careful attention to pulse and breath, all of it developing in near-total isolation from what was happening in Egypt, or Mesopotamia, or India, and yet arriving, again and again, at strikingly similar conclusions. That the body could be read like a landscape. That illness left signs, if you knew how to look. That healing required patience, more often than force. 4 rivers. 4 civilizations. No shared language, no shared writing system, often no contact at all, and yet each one, independently, built something that functioned. Something that helped. It is one of the quiet, remarkable patterns in the story of human survival. Given enough time and enough attention, people in wildly different corners of the world tend to arrive at surprisingly similar answers to the same aching questions. Further south, in ancient Mesoamerica, the civilizations that would later become known as the Maya and, still later, the Aztec, developed their own extensive medical traditions. Herbal gardens cultivated specifically for medicinal use, healers who specialized in particular ailments, and a documented understanding of certain plants' effects on pain, fever, and digestion that rivaled anything being recorded on the other side of the world at the same time. Steam baths, used both for hygiene and for treating respiratory illness, appear across multiple ancient American cultures, developed with no contact whatsoever with the sweat lodge and bathhouse traditions taking shape, separately, in other parts of the world. And in sub-Saharan Africa, oral traditions carried extensive botanical knowledge forward for millennia. Knowledge that, because it was never written down in the way Egyptian or Mesopotamian medicine was, is only now beginning to receive the same careful scholarly attention, much of it preserved by healers whose lineage of practice stretches back further than anyone can precisely date. The pattern holds, wherever we look closely enough. Different rivers, different skies, different words for pain, for fever, for healing. And underneath all of it, the same quiet determination to understand a body in distress and to do something, anything, that might ease it. In the ancient world, the line between medicine and ritual was not nearly as sharp as it is today. When someone fell seriously ill, in nearly every early culture we have evidence for, healing was not treated as a purely physical event. It was spiritual too. A shaman, an elder, a healer who understood both the properties of certain plants and the comfort of certain words, certain songs, certain gestures performed at the bedside. We sometimes look back at this and assume it was superstition standing in for real medicine. But it is worth pausing here, gently, because something more layered was happening. Ritual gave structure to fear. A song sung beside a feverish child did not lower the fever, but it may have steadied the hands of the person caring for that child. A ceremony performed before setting a broken bone did not knit the bone faster, but it gave everyone present a shared sense that something was being done, that the moment was not simply chaos. In some cultures, healers combined this ritual comfort with genuinely effective treatment, a poultice pressed onto a wound while a chant was spoken over it. The chant, we now understand, likely did little for the infection itself. But the poultice, made from the right plant, prepared the right way, often did. Two different kinds of medicine, offered at once. One for the body. One for the fear that illness always brings with it. There is something worth noticing in how consistently this pairing shows up, across cultures with no connection to one another. It suggests that ancient healers understood something we sometimes underappreciate even now, that illness is never purely physical in how it is experienced. Fear changes how pain feels. Isolation changes how slowly time moves for someone lying sick in the dark. A steady voice, a familiar song, a hand resting gently on a forehead, none of these things heal a wound directly. But they may have made the difference between a frightened patient and a calm one. And calm, we now understand far better than they could have, genuinely affects the body's ability to recover. The role of the healer, in many ancient societies, was not a role separated from the rest of community life. Often, it was held by someone already deeply woven into the fabric of daily existence. An elder respected for memory and patience, a woman known for her steady hands, someone whose calm presence had, over years, earned the trust of everyone around them. Becoming a healer, in this sense, was rarely a matter of formal training in the way we understand it now. It was a slow accumulation of trust, built one successful treatment, one steady vigil, one difficult night at a time. By the time a healer was widely recognized as such, they had usually already spent years quietly proving, again and again, that they could be relied upon when it mattered most. There is a category of ancient medical knowledge that rarely survives in the archaeological record, and rarely makes it into the histories we tell. Not because it mattered less, but because it was carried differently. Passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, almost always among women, and almost never written down. Midwifery may be one of the oldest continuous medical practices in human history. Long before any formal understanding of anatomy, women attending births had developed an intricate, practical knowledge of the process. How to recognize when labor was progressing normally, how to recognize when it wasn't, which positions eased a difficult delivery, which herbs could slow bleeding afterward, which could encourage a stalled labor forward. Skeletal evidence from ancient burial sites occasionally preserves traces of this world, a woman buried with her infant, evidence suggesting a birth that went wrong despite every effort. But far more common, when we look closely at population patterns across the ancient world, is the quieter evidence of success. Communities that grew. Generations that continued. Behind every one of those generations, women who had learned, through the accumulated experience of countless births before theirs, what a body in labor needed. This knowledge extended further than birth itself. In many ancient societies, the same women who assisted births were also the primary keepers of household medical knowledge. Which plant eased a child's fever, which remedy calmed a cough through the night, which combination of herbs could ease the pain of a wound until it healed on its own. This was medicine practiced in the smallest, quietest spaces, inside homes, beside sickbeds, in the hours between dusk and dawn when no formal healer was present, and someone still needed tending. It rarely appears in the grand narratives of ancient medicine, the ones built around papyrus scrolls and named physicians. But it may have saved more lives, across more centuries, than any of them. If you want to understand how ancient people survived sickness, sometimes the clearest answers come not from what they wrote or what they believed, but from what their bones quietly recorded. Paleopathologists, scientists who study disease in ancient remains, have learned to read skeletons the way a historian reads a manuscript. A certain kind of pitting on the surface of a skull can indicate chronic anemia, often caused by parasitic infection or malnutrition, endured for years. Grooves across the surface of teeth, called enamel hypoplasia, can mark moments of severe childhood illness or starvation, a kind of biological diary, written involuntarily, by a body under stress. And yet, what paleopathologists find again and again is not simply evidence of suffering. It is evidence of survival through suffering. Bones that show signs of severe illness in childhood, healed and remodeled by adulthood. Skeletons bearing the marks of old, healed infections that clearly could have been fatal, but weren't. Each one of these is a small, physical record of a body that endured something difficult, and a community that helped it endure. Consider, too, the evidence of dental work, teeth deliberately drilled, thousands of years before anything resembling modern dentistry, likely to relieve the pressure of an infected tooth. The holes are small, precise, clearly the work of someone who had done this before, someone who understood exactly where to place the pressure and how far to go. None of this happened in a hospital. None of it involved anesthesia as we understand it. And yet, again and again, the bones tell us, someone tried. Someone had enough understanding, enough steady hands, enough accumulated knowledge, to attempt something difficult. And often, remarkably, it worked well enough for the person to keep living, sometimes for decades afterward. There is a particular kind of respect owed to the healers behind these procedures, people whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, but whose skill is still legible, faintly, in bone that has outlasted everything else about them. We don't know what they were called by their communities. We don't know what stories were told about them, what they believed happened during a difficult procedure, what quiet rituals they performed before pressing a sharpened tool to someone's skull. All of that is gone. What remains is only the outcome. Smooth, healed bone, evidence of a hand that knew exactly how far it could go, and stopped exactly there. Individual wounds, individual fevers, these were survivable, given the right knowledge and the right hands. But every so often, across the ancient world, sickness arrived differently. Not as a single misfortune, but as something that moved through an entire community, and sometimes an entire region, all at once. We know, from later written records, of devastating epidemics that swept through the ancient Mediterranean, through early Chinese dynasties, through the cities of Mesopotamia. A plague described in the writings of ancient Athens, more than 2,000 years ago, killed a significant portion of the city's population within a few short years, arriving suddenly, spreading rapidly, and leaving behind descriptions so vivid that scholars still debate, to this day, exactly what disease it may have been. What is striking, reading these ancient accounts, is not only the scale of the loss, but the response. Even without understanding what caused the illness, ancient communities began developing responses that, in hindsight, align remarkably well with what we now know to be effective. Restricting movement. Avoiding crowded gatherings. Caring for the sick from a careful distance, when possible, while still ensuring they were not abandoned entirely. These were not scientific conclusions. They were observations, made under enormous pressure, by people watching their neighbors, their children, their elders fall ill one after another, and trying, desperately, to find some pattern in the chaos. Sometimes those patterns were wrong, blamed on the wrong causes entirely, on offended spirits or unlucky omens. But often, buried inside the wrong explanation, was a right response. A conclusion that happened to work, even when the reasoning behind it did not survive close scrutiny. It is a humbling thing to consider, that a community with no concept of viruses or bacteria could still, through sheer repeated experience, arrive at behaviors that modern epidemiology would later confirm as genuinely protective. Not because they understood the mechanism. Because they were paying close, careful attention to what seemed to help, and what seemed to make things worse, and they adjusted, generation after generation, accordingly. There is something almost unbearably poignant, reading the surviving fragments of ancient plague accounts, in how familiar the emotional landscape feels. Descriptions of streets grown quiet. Of families divided by illness, some members caring for the sick at great personal risk, others fleeing to protect children who had not yet fallen ill. Arguments, even then, about which response was the right one, whether to stay and tend to the suffering, or to leave and preserve what could still be saved. These were not abstract philosophical debates. They were lived, urgent, and painful, made by ordinary people with no modern understanding of disease, armed with nothing but observation, love, and fear, trying to make the least wrong choice they could in circumstances that offered no good ones. Not all ancient medical knowledge was about treatment. A great deal of it, perhaps the majority of it, though it leaves far less trace in the archaeological record, was about avoidance. Knowing which foods to steer clear of. Knowing which water sources ran clean, and which carried illness downstream from a rotting carcass or a stagnant marsh. Knowing which insects to fear, and which were harmless. This kind of knowledge rarely gets remembered as medicine, because it isn't dramatic. There is no wound to point to, no remedy to name. It is simply the long, patient accumulation of don't eat that root unless it's cooked a certain way, don't drink from that pool after the rains, don't sleep too close to that particular plant. Each don't represents, somewhere in the deep past, a lesson learned the hard way, by someone who didn't survive it, and was remembered afterward as a warning. Certain ancient dietary practices, once dismissed as superstition, have since been re-examined and found to carry a kind of embedded logic. Food preparation methods, soaking, fermenting, cooking certain plants for unusually long periods, often served, whether understood or not, to neutralize toxins or reduce the risk of parasites. Fermentation itself, one of humanity's oldest food technologies, does more than preserve food. It can also make certain nutrients more available, and can outcompete some of the harmful bacteria that would otherwise spoil a meal and sicken whoever ate it. None of this required a laboratory. It required generations of careful noticing, someone falling ill after eating something prepared one way, and staying well after eating the same food prepared differently. Multiply that observation across enough households, enough seasons, enough years, and eventually a pattern hardens into a rule. A rule that gets taught to children not as science, but as simply the way things are done, which is, in its own quiet way, exactly what science eventually becomes, once it's tested enough times to be trusted. Even something as ordinary as the placement of a settlement carried this same accumulated wisdom. Ancient communities, across wildly different climates, show a consistent preference for camps and villages situated near flowing water rather than still, a preference that, we now understand, likely reduced exposure to the parasites and bacteria that thrive in stagnant pools. They could not have explained this in the language we would use today. But they didn't need to. They only needed to notice, across enough generations, that the camps near moving water seemed to stay healthier than the camps that weren't, and to quietly favor one over the other, until the preference became so deeply embedded it was barely a decision at all. Just where you built. Just how it was done. What strikes me most, returning to all of this, is not how little our ancestors knew. It's how much they figured out anyway. They had no microscopes to reveal what caused a wound to fester. No thermometers to measure a rising fever with any precision. No understanding, in the modern sense, of blood, of cells, of the invisible world working beneath the skin. And still, piece by piece, generation by generation, they built something that functioned. Something that worked often enough to matter. Something that let a species with no natural claws, no thick fur, no great strength, survive plagues of illness across tens of thousands of years, in nearly every climate on Earth. Every single one of us alive today descends from someone who got sick, badly sick, and did not die. Someone who was cared for. Someone who was isolated at the right moment, or fed the right bark, or simply held through a fever until it broke on its own. That chain has never been broken. Not once, in all of human history. Somewhere behind every person breathing right now, there is an unbroken line of care, stretching back further than written language, further than agriculture, further than almost anything we consider the beginning of civilization. Think, too, about how much of this knowledge had to be relearned or rediscovered again and again by people who never knew of one another's existence. A healer in the Alps, packing a fungus into a leather pouch. A physician in Egypt, washing a wound with meticulous care. A practitioner in ancient China, mapping points across the body where pain seemed to concentrate. None of them knew the others existed. And yet, across the wide, disconnected span of the ancient world, human beings kept arriving at the same quiet truths, over and over, as though care itself were something written into us, not learned so much as remembered. We often measure ancient people by what they lacked. No antibiotics. No vaccines. No hospitals. But maybe it's worth measuring them, instead, by what they built without those things. A body of knowledge. A set of instincts. A willingness to sit beside someone suffering and simply not leave. That, too, is a kind of medicine. Maybe the oldest one we have. Consider, too, how much has had to be pieced back together, painstakingly, by modern researchers working with almost nothing. A scrape of plaque from a fossilized tooth, a leather pouch preserved by ice for over 5,000 years, a healed fracture in a bone buried for tens of thousands more. Each discovery is small. A single data point in an enormous, scattered puzzle. And yet, slowly, patiently, a picture has begun to emerge. Not of a species stumbling blindly through sickness and death, but of one that was, from remarkably early on, paying close attention. Testing. Remembering. Passing forward whatever seemed to help, and quietly discarding whatever didn't. It is worth remembering, too, that most of this knowledge has left no trace at all. For every fossilized tooth with plaque intact, for every mummified traveler preserved by ice, there were countless generations whose knowledge simply vanished, spoken, practiced, and then lost, the moment no one remained to carry it forward. What we have recovered is a fragment. A narrow, lucky sliver of a much larger, much older story, most of which is gone forever, and will never be known to us at all. That makes what does survive feel, if anything, even more precious. There is a particular kind of wonder in realizing how much of what we now consider modern was, in some form, already being practiced tens of thousands of years before the first hospital was ever built. The instinct to isolate the sick. The habit of choosing plants for their properties rather than their taste. The willingness to attempt surgery, however crude, when the alternative was certain loss. The understanding, even if unspoken, that a calm voice and a steady hand could matter almost as much as any remedy. None of these ideas were invented once, by one brilliant mind, in one fortunate place. They were discovered and rediscovered, and discovered again, independently, across oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years, by people who never knew the others existed, and who nonetheless arrived, again and again, at strikingly similar answers. As though the questions themselves, how do we keep each other alive, were always going to lead, eventually, to the same quiet truths. Modern medicine, for all its extraordinary power, did not appear from nothing. It grew slowly and unevenly, out of exactly this deep, scattered foundation, out of willow bark chewed for pain long before aspirin had a name, out of honey pressed into wounds long before anyone understood antisepsis, out of careful hands setting bones long before anatomy was formally studied at all. Every modern doctor, whether they think of it this way or not, is standing at the far end of an unbroken line of healers stretching back to that first cave, that first fire, that first person, who knelt beside someone suffering and decided, quietly, to try. Perhaps that is the real story here. Not that ancient humans lacked medicine, but that medicine, in its very first form, was never a substance at all. It was attention. It was memory, passed hand to hand. It was someone choosing, quietly, to stay. And in some small, unspoken way. Every time we care for someone who is unwell today, we are still doing exactly what they did around a fire tens of thousands of years ago. If this kind of quiet history is one you'd like to sit with more often, you're welcome to stay a while longer here. Thank you for spending this time with us.